Well, I think everyone gathered here this evening is local, and it probably can't have escaped your notice over the last couple of weeks or so that the tall ships visited Falmouth. I thought, therefore, it was a good opportunity to turn back to the 33rd chapter of Isaiah and to take you to this portion of the passage, particularly from verse 17 to verse 24, the end of the chapter, where we find several references, 3 specific references to various types of ship or boat. I'm never quite sure of the technical distinction, but I'm sure John will tell me later. We find particularly in verse 21, no galley with oars. We find in verse 21 also majestic ships, probably in the mind of the writer very much akin to the tall ships, those masted ships with their massive sails. But then in the 23rd verse we also find a reference to a sailing vessel, and that sailing vessel is in distress, is in trouble, is in difficulty. Your tackle is loosed. They could not, the rigging therefore is not supportive of the mast, not functioning in the right way. They could not strengthen their mast, they could not spread the sail. This is a picture of a disabled vessel, a vessel that might have been once functional but now is not. And as we come to that question in the 23rd verse, we will be addressing the issue of whether this is a picture of a nation or an individual that is set against God and in opposition to God, or whether potentially this is a picture of the people of God, of Israel, in a condition that is a dysfunctional and disobedient condition. Israel rejecting God. Without going into that immediately, verse 14 of Isaiah 33 tells us the sinners in Zion are afraid. Zion is in a sense a mixed multitude. There are those who are true believers in the Lord Jesus Christ yet to come. But there are also those who are hypocritical, those who are taken up with an outward form of religion without any inward reality, without any kernel within. And therefore the prophet has been identifying this. Well, let's come to verses 17 and onwards in Isaiah 33. We'll set some sort of context before we come to these 3 different vessels. I point out, by the way, that each one of these vessels is, of course, dependent upon non-mechanical means of propulsion. The galley has its oars, the majestic ship looks for the wind, the disabled vessel is also looking for the wind. None of them is independent of these things. The galley, of course, with its rows perhaps of slaves, that one most able to go against the wind. But we have these 3 examples. And of course, God gives us in his word not simply the portions of his word which are, as it were, logical, argumentative steps, as Paul's epistle to the Romans. Some of us thrive on those logical steps. We've been brought up, perhaps our professional upbringing has been in background in some sort of legal basis, and something like the Roman epistle appeals to us. Others of us learn in terms of pictures, and God gives us word pictures and images again and again in his word. You think of the example, Ephraim is a cake half turned. Well, anyone who's ever baked a cake has a good idea. I know someone who used to tell their little child that it was usual that the cake should be a shipwreck cake, and you had to fill in a deep amount of icing into the middle of the cake because it was usual that a cake would sink. Well, if anyone is watching this later, you may well know the person that I'm talking of, but you will be some miles from here if you do. As I say, the Bible is full of these pictures, and many of us learn best and take in best when there is a picture that we take in, as it were, of our mind, even if it is a picture that is described in words. The book of Revelation has been described as a picture book of the Bible. It is a picture book, but they are word pictures, where the pictures are described in words. Well, let's come then to this passage. And as I've already intimated from verse 14, there is a sense in which the prophet is dealing not simply with those who are fervent believers in Israel, but he is dealing with those who are potentially backslidden or potentially unbelievers at all. The sinners in Zion are afraid. And in verse 16 of Isaiah 33, we come to this wonderful security and safety of the believer. He will dwell on high, his place of defense, and as I said earlier, the Authorized Version has that lovely, memorable place. His place of defense will be the munition of rocks. Bread will be given him, his water will be sure. Actually, that little phrase, that last phrase there, his water will be sure, is particularly poignant in Isaiah, because it was King Hezekiah who made sure that the water supply of Jerusalem was brought in by way of tunnel, as Steve Fountain reminded us the other day. And you can go into the British Museum and you can see a replica of the plaque on the wall, just as when they joined the Channel Tunnel under the English Channel, and the two tunnels met from each end. So when the tunnellers in Hezekiah's day completed their conduit to bring in the water into Jerusalem, well, they also put a little tablet on the wall. No one would see it because it was a water channel. No one was going to be there to see it, but they put it there as a mark of their construction genius, because it was a work of genius and quick work as well. And so the expression, his water will be sure, is particularly appropriate in this book of Isaiah. Well, verse 17 gives us the prospect that is before all Christian people. And it is a prospect that should excite us and should thrill us. And if it doesn't excite us and thrill us, if it doesn't mean that there is something here that causes our heart to beat faster, then we should question whether we are in a healthy state as Christians. Your eyes will see the King in his beauty. Now, Job, of course, knew that though the worms were to destroy his body, though his flesh should be destroyed, yet in his flesh he would see God. And here Isaiah reinforces that. The prospect before a believer, that what is called the beatific vision, is to see God. Your eyes will see the King in his beauty. Christ is beautiful. God is beautiful. That is a most wonderful thing to be able to say. God is not harsh and hard. God is beautiful. The King is beautiful. He has a beauty that is inherent to his being God. It is a beauty that is entrenched and embedded in his holiness. The beauty of holiness. There is something about God from which all else that is beautiful derives its sense and meaning. I would suggest to you actually that the very fact that we can comprehend beauty, that we can recognize beauty, and especially that each individual in this room will see and understand beautiful things differently, so that something that I think is beautiful may not be something that you think is beautiful, may not be something that the third person thinks is beautiful. But the very fact of this is indicative that human beings have an existence which is modelled upon and derived from God himself, who is beautiful, and that therefore we have a perception of beauty. It is very hard for the evolutionist to come up with a reason for an individual to have a perception of beauty. Why does it matter that I see a sunset and recognize it as beautiful? I could recognize the colours, but I don't need to appreciate beauty to have an evolutionary survival advantage. I can look at a sunflower, but I don't need to recognize beauty in that sunflower in order to have an evolutionary advantage. The perception of beauty is an indicator of a divine being who has created us in his image. The fact that we can recognize beauty in so many spheres of life, whether it is art, whether it is great engineering or great architecture, whether it is sound, music, whether it is the human form. The fact we can recognize beauty is reminding us that God ultimately is beautiful in the most fundamental and profound sense that we can imagine. And this is the prospect that is being set before Christian people. As the Beatitudes say, blessed are the pure in heart. Why are they blessed? Because they shall see God. This is not the sight of God by faith, because it is a prospect still before us. We would, if we see God by faith, it is a present enjoyment of God. But this is a prospect before us. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. There is coming a time when every eye shall see him. And it is the King. It is the King in his majesty and authority. It is the King whom we kiss in obeisance if we become Christians. But it is the King who, whether or not we have kissed him in obeisance, we shall recognize him as King one day. And there will be those for whom that will be a moment of terror and a moment of trembling. But here we see the reality that this present life, this present existence, is far off from the glory that is to come. They will see the land that is very far off. You know, the glory that is to come is very different from what we experience now. The new heaven and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness is very different from the beauty we experience and see now. But there is something which is, as it were, reminding us. Verse 18, your heart will meditate on terror. Where is the scribe? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? Now here we have a recognition of the need for someone to be aware of resources. Someone to make sure that there is an adequate and sufficient provision, and especially in time of siege, as verse 16 had, bread will be given him, his water will be sure. The counting of the towers may well be indicative of the one who very carefully evaluates a military structure. You know, the shape of castles is not an accident. In a time in this country when castles were being built, it was necessary they employed experts to design the castles. They're not simply square, most of them. They have a broad squareness, but they're not quite square. But they actually brought in experts from Europe who were designers to bring these castles, to make sure that the turrets are in the right places. You had the turrets with the ability to have arcs of fire and so on. And the phrase in here is of a place that is secured, but you don't need these things, you see. Where is the scribe? Where is he who weighs? You don't need these things. You've been protected. You've been removed from the conflict. You will not see a fierce people. You've been used to a time of conflict. You've been used to a time of hardship and difficulty in battle. You've been used to a time when you were on the point of being overwhelmed by superior forces. But you see, this is all far gone now, and this is in the past. You will not see a fierce people, a people of obscure speech beyond perception, of a stammering tongue that you cannot understand. Those latter verses, by the way, are important when we come to what happens in the book of Acts. As the book of Acts unfolds in Acts chapter 2, and there is this ability to speak in other languages other than Hebrew, and that is not only a reminder of the gospel spread into every tribe, every tongue, every nation, every language group, but is a reminder that the Jewish nation has come under the judgment of God for all that has happened. And there is going to be that judgment upon the people. And there will be the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And so that which occurred on the day of the Acts of the Pentecost, well, that's partly reminiscent of these verses here. Obscure speech, stammering tongue. It was judgment upon God's people. And then there is this wonderful description of the people of God. And the people of God in their settled and peaceful home. There may not be much that is, as it were, lovely to look upon. There may not be that which is luxurious to look upon or strong to look upon. But its strength is in God. And notice how this is put. Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feasts, the time and place when God will meet with his people. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet home. This isn't the Jerusalem, the physical city. This is the new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. This is a place where, as the epistle to the Hebrews has it, that we find the spirits of just men made perfect. And then you see, the appearance might be that this is not very strong. It's a tabernacle. What's a tabernacle? It's a tent. Well, you go to some of the campsites when the gale is raging in July or August. I know some people who went camping in these times. They shortened their time there. It was windy, it was wet, it was muddy. Well, you'll say that's why you go camping. Well, some people might. But a tabernacle, you see, it has a sense of vulnerability. But there is no vulnerability here, because the strength of this tabernacle is in God. A tabernacle that will not be taken down. Not one of its stakes will ever be removed. Here is a tabernacle that has its strength in God. Nor will any of its cords be broken. But there, the majestic Lord, there is a reminder of his kingship, you see, his majesty. There, the majestic Lord, the King, if you like, will be for us a place of broad rivers and streams. It's a glorious picture. It's a beautiful picture. It's mindful of the beauty we see around us so often here in this part of the world. Broad rivers and streams. But then we have two negatives, two prohibitions. You know, the Bible tells us that when there is a new heaven and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness, that when there is a new Jerusalem, there will be those who cannot enter in. There will be those who are not able to enter, and that is because of their rejection of God's purpose for them. You can look up that later in Luke chapter 7, or the parallel in Matthew 7. But if you look at Revelation 21 verse 8, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. But then when you read on to verse 8 of Revelation 21, but the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. They're not going to be in the Jerusalem. They're going to be in that lake of fire. They cannot enter in. And there is a prohibition here. These two vessels, these two wonderfully constructed vessels, potentially, they cannot reach, cannot enter. A place of broad rivers and streams should be the place where galleys and majestic ships should be in their element. That's what ships are for. There used to be a criticism of the various fleets in the First World War, because people would say, well, we're keeping our fleet in harbour so that we don't lose the war in an afternoon. Well, you see, these vessels should have been in their element, but they're not allowed. Why not? Let's look at what is signified here in verse 21. No galley with oars will sail. What is this speaking of? It's speaking of human effort. It's speaking of human achievement. It's speaking even of people together working to try and achieve something, just as the slaves or those who are rowing the boat, if not slaves, they are working together, perhaps with the rhythm of a drum beat, to keep them in time, to keep them going, to keep them powering through the waves by their own strength. The thinking here is that nobody gets to God by their own efforts. It is impossible. The just shall live by faith. It is impossible that anyone will work their way to heaven. No galley can pass by. A galley depends upon human effort. I don't know if you ever saw a galley in your time in the Merchant Navy, whether there were galleys, not the old ones, I'm not saying you were 2,000 years old, but
I've seen them in South America where they used to oars, very large,
large canoe type things. Yeah.
They were quite big. I think in South America.
Well, the galley with oars, no human effort will suffice to bring you to God. But then the majestic ships, and this is where I thought of this when the tall ships came in. Because those tall ships, they're impressive. They come in with their sails furled. One of the great ships came in. Every yard arm had the crew members standing upon it. I don't know whether they had safety harnesses or not. I dread to think if they didn't. But they were all standing on these yard arms. Most impressive. I have no head for heights at all. I would have been clinging to the mast for dear life. But most impressive boats. But the point is, that which is of human pride, that which is of human achievement, human pomp, It cannot pass by. These ships, I think it's true that the oldest commissioned warship in the world is actually HMS Victory in the dry dock in Portsmouth. But the oldest actual sailing ship that still sails isn't Victory. Victory is in dry dock. It hasn't sailed for many years. But the Americans have a ship, I think it hails from their Civil War, from their, not the Civil War, probably the war against the British, the War of Independence. But they have a ship that is not only is a part of the American Navy and duly constituted as such, but actually it sails in the water. So arguably our American neighbours, and I hate to say this, are doing slightly better than us with the Victory, because Victory no longer sails. You can have high-ranking meetings on board Victory if you want. If you're an admiral of the fleet or something, you can use the room and have a meeting in the room where Nelson had his conferences and so on. But as I say, the Americans we have to bow to, because they still have this wonderful old sailing ship, many years old, and it's still actually afloat and still sails. But the point is, they're majestic ships, and nothing of that. No human pride, not only no human effort with the galleys, but no human pride can enter God's presence. God